For today's film, we'll be looking at another classic noir which happens to take place in Los Angeles and thus lights up 3 of our 4 corners. I'm talking about The Big Sleep, a 1946 film based on a classic hard-boiled detective novel written by Raymond Chandler, one of the other big names in detective fiction, along with Dashiell Hammett. The story about the story. While The Maltese Falcon was a low-budget risk, featuring a bunch of new-to-their-role and new-to-Hollywood actors, and a freshman director, all of whom would go on to do great things, The Big Sleep was a film stocked with veteran actors and directed by a man who was already a Hollywood legend, Howard Hawks. Hawks had started directing way back in 1926, back during the silent film era, and he put out a ton of films in all the decades that followed. The only time he slowed down was in the 1970s, the decade of his death. Many of his films have achieved classic status, such as Scarface, the original 1931 version, The Thing from Another World, the original 1951 version, Gentlemen Prefer Blondes, Rio Bravo, and El Dorado. He also directed Sergeant York, which came up during the game. And go figure, but John Huston was on that film's writing team. By 1945, the year most of The Big Sleep was shot, Humphrey Bogart was well established as a leading man. But the leading lady, Lauren Bacall, was actually in a tight spot. She had started out her career as a Broadway actor and a model, but in 1943 she was discovered by Howard Hawks, who would take her under his wing and train her to be a lead actress. Her first film was 1944's To Have and Have Not, and while she originally had a minor role, she had such chemistry with Bogart, the lead, that her part was revised and then revised again until she became the female lead. And that chemistry was quite real. Despite a 25-year age difference, Bogart and Bacall began to have an affair on set, and Bogart would go on to divorce his wife, at that point his third, and marry Bacall. The two would remain together until Bogart's death in 1957. Unfortunately, Bacall was unable to recapture the magic of her first performance in her second film, Confidential Agent, in which she starred opposite Charles Boyer. Still, Howard Hawks wasn't about to give up on her, so he reunited her with her new husband in The Big Sleep, a move which ultimately cemented her Hollywood career. In fact, before the film's release, Bacall's agent convinced Jack Warner, the producer, to allow Hawks to reshoot some of the scenes to ramp up the relationship between Bacall and Bogart's characters, a move which most people agree was the right decision, despite how it got rid of some desperately needed exposition in the process. The story. Like I was saying last week, the convoluted plot of The Big Sleep involves way too many characters, relationships, and murders, something it inherited from the original book. According to Ray Chandler's own account, the filmmakers were having some trouble figuring out who killed the chauffeur, so they sent a message to the author and asked him straight out. His response was, "Damn it, I don't know either." So with that in mind, I'm going to be summarizing the story chronologically rather than as things are revealed to the protagonist, so that you can hopefully make more sense of things than I did on my first viewing. So everything starts when Sean Regan becomes the drinking buddy of General Sternwood, a man who lived hard when he was young and is now paralyzed below the waist, cannot drink or smoke, and has to spend his days in a hot and humid greenhouse. As Regan spends time with Sternwood, Sternwood's younger daughter, Carmen, develops feelings for Regan. But Regan's got his heart set on Mona Mars, the wife of a gang boss, Eddie Mars. Carmen responds to Regan's refusal by getting high and killing him. And her older sister, Vivian Rutledge, divorced, covers this fact up along with Eddie Mars, who happens to know enough to blackmail the Sternwood family. The film begins with Philip Marlowe entering the Sternwood estate to get a job from the general. On his way in, Carmen flirts with him, acknowledging Bogart's famously short height in the process. When Marlowe meets the general, they discuss the Sternwood family. A year ago, the General paid a man named Joe Brody blackmail money for an undisclosed incident involving Carmen, and Sean Regan handled the details. Now, Carmen has gambling debts that need paying to a man named Geiger, who supposedly operates a rare bookshop. See, I told you it would come up. And since Regan apparently disappeared a month ago, the General called Marlowe in. Sternwood suspects that something's going on, since Carmen isn't a gambler, and Marlowe takes the case. On his way out, Vivian Rutledge calls on Marlowe. Vivian is played by Lauren Bacall, and to say the least, I am never going to do justice to the conversations that go on between the two. The whole movie is full of clever, fast-paced writing, but these two have the best conversations of all. Really, their dynamic is the whole reason to watch the movie. Rutledge spends some time trying to figure out whether Marlowe was hired to track down Sean Regan, but Marlowe only says that that's not the reason before heading out. Marlowe spends a few hours researching famous rare books, and then goes to Geiger's rare bookshop, changes his appearance, and asks the woman at the counter about a couple rare books. She says they don't have any, and that Mr. Geiger isn't in, but when another man enters the store, she buzzes him through the back door without a word. Marlowe then leaves the shop and heads to the bookstore across the street to speak with the clerk about Geiger's appearance and the rare books he mentioned before, and after she confirms that they don't exist, Marlowe makes it clear that Geiger's shop is only a front. So the clerk tells Marlowe about Geiger's appearance, flirts with him, and as he waits for Geiger to come out, she takes off her glasses and pulls her hair out of a ponytail because apparently Hollywood has been using that for instant beauty transformation for generations. Personally, I like the mousy look, but the clerk isn't a main character, so whatever. Eventually, Geiger's assistant, a man named Lundgren, shows up to drive him away, and Marlowe follows. They drive up to Geiger's house, and as Marlowe watches the place, Carmen shows up and goes inside. A few hours pass, and then there's a flash, a scream, and then 3 shots ring out. As Marlowe tries to get in, someone races out the back door, and 2 cars flee the scene. As we'll later find out, the Sternwood family chauffeur, who has fallen in love with Carmen, was trying to protect her by killing Geiger. Marlowe gets in the house through a window and discovers Geiger dead on the ground, Carmen high as a kite, a camera concealed in a tacky antique whose film roll is missing, and a codebook with some unknown information on the Sternwoods. Marlowe takes Carmen home in her car and tells the family to pretend she's been home all evening. But when he goes back for his own car, he gets a hunch and investigates the crime scene again. Sure enough, things have moved around, and the body is missing. Marlowe is working on the codebook when Bernie Oles, a DA investigator and Marlowe's friend, stops by. A Packard belonging to the Sternwoods has gone off a pier, and the family chauffeur was on it. But it's clear from the evidence that he was dead before he could drown. The next morning, Rutledge is waiting for Marlowe at his office. She's received a blackmail note complete with the photo from the night before, and when she fidgets as she claims ignorance, Marlowe dares her to call the police. She does so, but Marlowe interrupts her, and they do this weird thing where they put on a show for the poor desk sergeant. Like I said, I cannot do their interactions justice. Rutledge then explains that she can get the money for the blackmail from Eddie Mars, and at this point she tells a story about Regan running off with Eddie's wife. Marlowe heads back to Geiger's shop and notices that they're packing everything up, so he hires a taxi to tail them to Randall Arms Apartments. Turns out that's where Joe Brody, the first blackmailer, lives. Heading back to Geiger's house, Marlowe encounters Carmen again. It's unclear how much she remembers from the night before, but Marlowe reiterates that she shouldn't say anything about it to anyone. Then another man enters the house and starts asking Marlowe what he's doing there. He apparently doesn't know about Geiger's death, but he owns the house, and Marlowe correctly guesses that this is Eddie Mars. They then talk circles around each other until they both leave. That evening, Rutledge calls and says she hasn't heard from the blackmailer, so Marlowe should stay put until she does. But Marlowe gets another hunch and heads over to Joe Brody's place. Sure enough, Rutledge shows up and goes in, so Marlowe follows, getting into Brody's place by saying that he has the cipher book. While he's there, they clear up a few things. Brody didn't kill Geiger. Like I said, the chauffeur killed him. But Brody did clean up the body, kill the chauffeur and steal the photo from him, and finally, he cleared out the shop. As they're negotiating, Carmen shows up with a gun to get the picture, and in the chaos, Marlowe manages to get everybody's guns and sends the two Sternwood daughters home with the film negative. Once they've left, Marlowe discusses the two murders with Brody at greater length. Then, Lundgren, Geiger's assistant, shows up at the door and shoots Brody twice. Marlowe heads Lundgren off and gets him into his car at gunpoint, taking him back to Geiger's place. Oddly enough, Geiger's body has reappeared, so Marlowe figures he'll let the cops know about both of them. What comes next is the biggest scene added in 1946 for the sake of the Bogart-Bacall dynamic. Rutledge and Marlowe meet at a restaurant and flirt while discussing horses. But when Rutledge tries to pay Marlowe's bill, he realizes that she's trying to deflect him away from Eddie Mars and Regan. Thus, Marlowe heads to Eddie's place that evening where he discovers Rutledge singing with the band, and he discusses the situation with Eddie, who insists that Regan and his wife are actually missing, and that Rutledge isn't very popular at his casino. Sure enough, Marlowe witnesses Rutledge win big at the tables and then get accosted in the parking lot, but as he points out during the drive home, they were trying way too hard to make it look like the two of them weren't collaborating. He then asks Rutledge what's going on, but she won't say, not even after they kiss. When he gets back to his apartment, Marlowe finds Carmen waiting for him. Once again, it's unclear what she wants, but Marlowe asks her about Sean Regan and Eddie Mars, and then shoves her out the door. The next day, Bernie tells Marlowe to lay off the Sternwood case, and apparently it's because Rutledge leaned on the DA. Marlowe then tries to call the general, but Rutledge intercepts the call to say that Regan was found in Mexico and she was about to head out to meet him. Just afterwards, two of Eddie's men beat the crap out of Marlowe and tell him again to lay off. At this point, a man named Harry Jones, who's been following Marlowe for a while, decides that now is the perfect time to introduce himself. Incidentally, Jones is played by Elisha Cook Jr., the same man who played Wilmer in The Maltese Falcon. He works with Agnes, Brody's now former girlfriend, and he wants $200 so that Agnes will tell Marlowe where Eddie Mars's wife is. They agree to meet in an old office building an hour later, but before Marlowe can talk with Jones, one of Eddie's men kills him. Fortunately, Agnes calls soon after and Marlowe gets his information. Mona Mars is in a house up north by a rural car shop. Marlowe heads up and makes his entrance by pretending to have car troubles. Sadly, this doesn't stop the two men inside the shop from knocking him out. When he wakes up, he's in the house, tied up, and in the company of Mrs. Mars. Rutledge shows up soon after and asks him why he kept going, and all Marlowe can say is that too many people asked him to stop. As the conversation continues, Marlowe discovers that Mona doesn't know her husband is a gangster, and when he confronts her about it, she throws her drink in his face and leaves. When they're alone, Marlowe makes it clear to Rutledge that he's a dead man once Mars knows where he is. So after a quick kiss, she cuts the ropes holding him and acts as a distraction so he can ambush the men sent to kill him. After that, they head back once more to Geiger's place to force a confrontation with Eddie Mars. Marlowe tricks Eddie into thinking he'll be showing up later, so when Eddie enters the house alone, Marlowe gets the drop on him. It's at this point that they finally explain that Carmen killed Regan and Eddie blackmailed Rutledge over it, and then Marlowe shoots a vase in Eddie's arm so that he'll run outside and get shot by his own men who will think that he's Marlowe trying to escape. Marlowe then calls Bernie to bring the cops over and tells Rutledge that he'll say Eddie killed Regan and otherwise stick with the facts. He also says that Carmen should get some professional help at a mental institution. But aside from that, The Big Sleep ends on a remarkably positive note for a noir. Final thoughts. In terms of its plot, LA Noire seems to have borrowed most heavily from certain neo-noir movies such as LA Confidential, Chinatown, and I'll be getting to those towards the end of this LP. However, as far as the procedure of the game goes, I'd say it borrows most heavily from The Big Sleep. The Big Sleep is told completely from Marlowe's point of view, which is partly why the plot seems so confusing. Though this does let the audience share Marlowe's own confusion, which you can see every time Bogart rubs his ear. This also lets you see how Marlowe uncovers the plot. He visits businesses in disguise, he grills subjects and witnesses who get visibly antsy when they're lying. He investigates crime scenes for clues. He spends time researching at his office and the public library. He tails cars and stakes out residences he identifies by checking the names on mailboxes, and he makes phone calls to set up meetings and collect important information. Sam Spade may have called himself a private detective, but all he really did was stick his nose in where it didn't belong. Philip Marlowe, on the other hand, conducted an actual investigation. Thanks for joining me again for today's film review, and I hope you'll join me next time for a famous movie about a kid who dies in a car accident, starring a kid who would later die in a car accident.